Section 18 of Wanderings in New South Wales, Batavia, Pedir Coast, Singapore and China, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jennifer Beckett-Wood. Wanderings in New South Wales, Batavia, Pedir Coast, Singapore and China, Volume 1 by George Bennett. Chapter 18. On the 14th of March, I left Sydney in the ship Sir Thomas Munro for Batavia. Taking the southern passage, the winds obliged us to pass round Van Diemen's Land. On the 22nd, Schouten's Island was seen bearing west by south, and St. Patrick's Head northwest by compass, about 25 miles distant. And on the 23rd, Cape Pilar bore west by south half south, and Maria Island north by west half west by compass, distant about 30 miles. We had to beat against strong westerly winds, and at noon on the 22nd of April, D'Entrecasteaux Point bore east by north, distant about 20 miles, an extreme of the land to the northward, northeast by compass. The appearance of the coast was sterile. On the 23rd, we passed Cape Leeuwin. When first seen, it had the appearance of a moderately high island, the land connecting it with the main being low and not at that time visible from the deck. On the 26th, we were off Rottnest Island, which was of a moderate height and most sterile appearance. The mainland was sandy and scrubby. Numerous fires were seen where land was clearing. A boat came off as we were endeavouring to beat into Gage's roads and came alongside with 2 gentlemen in her. They could furnish us, however, with no news respecting the Dutch war, to attain information respecting which was the object of our wishing to touch at this place. In reply to our inquiries respecting the state of the new colony, they said it was rapidly progressing. Of the settlements at King George's Sound and Port Augusta, the latter was reported as succeeding better than the former. There had been lately several arrivals with livestock from Hobart Town, and a brig, the Dart, from Sydney, was then standing in for Gage's Roads with a cargo of provision and livestock. Sheep at this period were selling for 30 to 40 shillings each, flour from 20 to 30 pounds per ton, and potatoes at the enormous price of 25 pounds per ton. It was expected, however, that in the course of another year the colony would be able to raise produce sufficient for its consumption. No vessels had been lost at Swan River since the first year, and with common precautions it was considered there was no risk. At 2 p.m. we proceeded on our voyage to Batavia. On the 13th of May we had the southeast trade, in latitude 21 degrees 15 minutes south, longitude 138 degrees 13 minutes east. On the 4th of May we crossed from 108 degrees 13 minutes to 106 degrees 58 minutes east longitude, in a run of 8 days from Swan River, being the track recommended by Horsburgh, to look for the trial rocks, but did not see them. On the 5th, several tropic birds of the roseate and white species were about the ship, although we were then distant 370 miles from Christmas Island, which was the nearest land. On the 7th, boobies, frigate birds, and white and rose-coloured tropic birds indicated the vicinity of Christmas Island, which was seen about midnight by the light of the moon, bearing northeast by north by compass, distant 12 or 14 miles. On the 10th, we were becalmed 3 or 4 miles off the southwest side of Clapp's Island, which was low, densely wooded with cocoa palms and other trees, even to the water's edge. A heavy surf rolled upon the sandy beach and on reefs extending from each extremity. Early in the morning on the 11th we were off the northwest side of Prince's Island, and the land wind brought with it a delicious balmy fragrance. The extensive reef, running out a long distance from the southwest point on which a heavy surf broke, was distinctly seen. This island, low at one part, is high and mountainous at another. It was late in the afternoon before we had a clear view of its lofty peaked mountain. The island was densely wooded, having a picturesque and verdant appearance. During the morning, which was showery, we slowly coasted along the island at about 4 or 5 miles distant. As the weather cleared up about noon, the scenery gratified the eye with its varied tints, refreshed by the genial showers, and recalled to my memory those gems of the ocean distributed over the Polynesian archipelago. As we proceeded along the Java coast, having the lofty Krakatoa Peak and others of the adjacent islands in view, light and variable winds and calms, with adverse currents, rendered our passage slow and tedious, and often obliged us to anchor. We were, on these occasions, visited by canoes, with fowls, eggs, turtle, etc. The outline of this island is at some parts low, wooded, and uninteresting, while at others lofty mountains rise one above the other until the towering Mount Karang terminates the view. The varied tints of the vegetation, covering the mountains from the margin of the sea to the loftiest summits the eye could attain, had a rich and beautiful appearance as the setting sun cast its rays over the landscape. Occasionally the thatched Javanese habitations became visible, peeping from beneath a canopy of wood. Most Malay villages are buried amidst the foliage of tropical fruit and other trees, which form a cool and agreeable shelter, but such situations cannot be regarded as conducive to health. After a tedious passage since making the island of Java, we passed Onrust Island, which is the marine depot, where ships are hove down and repaired. There are some neat buildings erected upon it, with rows of trees before them, in the usual Dutch style, but silence reigned. There was no bustle, and the black countenances of 2 sepoys were all the human beings visible. We anchored in Batavia roads on the 21st, and the scene before us was a low, wooded coast, lofty mountains in the distance, a few tiled houses or native huts scattered among the trees, and an extensive jetty which is erecting on each side of the river. The town, being built on a swamp and planted with trees, was entirely concealed from the shipping in the roadstead. The following day we passed up the river by the boat being tracked, the current running down at a rapid rate, preventing boats being pulled against it. On each side an extensive wooden jetty was erecting, a great portion of which was now completed. It extended to the bar at the river's entrance, with a breakwater in front, having a passage on each side for boats. The expense of the construction of this jetty is paid by a duty of 5% being levied upon the amount of duties on all imported goods. A number of native convicts were employed in driving piles, etc., to complete this very useful undertaking. On arriving at the custom house, our boat was searched. Miserable houses lined the river on either side. Coconut palms and other trees, including the Thespasia pulpulnea, were planted about the dwellings. Masses of filth, dead and putrid bodies of dogs, hogs, and other animals float down the river, impeding the boats in their passage. These carcasses serve to feed the numerous alligators, buaya of the Javanese, which infest the river in great numbers, but are useful in removing the putrefying substances which would otherwise be destructive to health in this sultry climate. The alligators are held sacred by the Javanese, who consequently never destroy them. Indeed, the good understanding seems mutual, for I observed native convicts working up to the waist in the water, not far from these voracious creatures, reposing like logs on the surface of the water, without fear or apprehension, injury from them never being experienced. Some say the alligators are too well fed with the offal and carcasses coming down the river. Others, that the reptiles have a respect for black skins, for should a European enter the river like the natives, he would be attacked by these formidable creatures. I saw a number of these reptiles one morning assembled about a dead buffalo which had floated down the river near the bar. From the size of some of them, they must have survived several generations. We landed near a row of neat houses, having trees planted in front, which conduced, in this sultry climate, to afford an agreeable shelter from the fervour of the sun. These buildings were principally occupied as stores and offices by the merchants. The streets of Batavia run for the most part in a north and south direction, are kept in neat order, regularly watered, and planted with rows of trees in the Dutch style. These formerly adorned the banks of canals which intersected the streets, rendering the city as pestilential a place as could be met with between the tropics. During the brief period the island was under the British government, the canals were filled up, the main stream of the Grand River and its tributaries alone remaining. The houses in the city are spacious, but only used as offices and stores by merchants and others, on account of the insalubrity of the city during the night. Having concluded business by 4 or 5 o'clock p.m., they drive to their residences in the vicinity. On the afternoon of my arrival, I drove out with Mr. Vidal, a mercantile gentleman resident in Batavia, to Molenfleet, about 2 miles from the city, passing on the road some mansions in the usual style of Dutch architecture, having gardens before them filled with various flowering shrubs and plants, among which the hibiscus rosa chinensis, poinciana pulcherrima, and ixora, in full blossom, were conspicuous from the brilliancy of their colours. We arrived at a tavern kept by a Monsieur Choulin, pleasantly situated at this place, but it is ill conducted, although the best and most respectable. The proprietor, having realised a fortune, does not consider it requisite to devote any further attention on those by whom he acquired it. Our after-dinner display disappointed me, from having heard and read so much of the delicious fruits of Batavia, both for flavour and variety. The dessert was miserable. The rambutan, fruit of the Nephelium echinatum, or hairy fruit, rambut signifying hairy, and some mangosteens were good. The oranges were insipid, and the soursop, introduced from the West Indies, was the best fruit upon the table. Indeed, I may observe with truth that I hardly tasted a good fruit during my stay at Batavia, except the pineapple and mangosteen. But it seems that fruits arrive at perfection in particular districts of the island of Java, there being one in which mangosteens abound, at another, where the land is cool and elevated, pears, apples, and strawberries are produced. Every kind is cultivated about Batavia, but none, excepting the pineapple, attain excellence. The little Java ponies excited my attention, but these beautiful animals cannot endure much fatigue. They are purchased from 30 to 150 Java rupees each, and if exported, there is an export duty of nearly £2 each. The residents are obliged to keep several of these animals, and there are always some incapable of duty from sickness. The Javanese consider that by keeping a species of monkey in the stable, the horses will not get sick, and should they become indisposed, Jacko possesses powers to cure them. The more valuable the monkey employed for the purpose, the more readily will the horses be cured, or the better will they be preserved in health. The Lampong monkey, brought from the Lampong Islands, is highly esteemed for this purpose by the superstitious Javanese for its qualities as a veterinary doctor. A lad at one residence, who had charge of the horses, threatened to leave his master's service on some of the horses getting sick, unless a monkey was procured for the stable. One of the Lampong kind was consequently purchased to attend upon the sick quadrupeds. Soon after the monkey had been in attendance, the sick horses began to recover, and in a short time were declared fit for duty, thus proving, whatever our grooms may think on the subject, that a monkey of the veterinary doctor species is an invaluable appendage to a stud of horses, and ought to be imported and bred by the Zoological Society for this express purpose. An accident, however, occurred shortly after the monkey had taken up his residence in the stable, which placed him on the sick list and made him a subject of surgical care. Being tired of driving away the flies which tormented his patients, he sought for variety, and observing, in the horses' tails, some grey hairs mingled with the black, To prevent the animals looking older than they really were, he began in the kindest manner to pluck them out. A kick, which laid poor Jacko prostrate at a distance, with a swollen physiognomy and fractured forearm, was the ungracious return made for this piece of service, thus reversing the old saying of, "One good turn deserves another." After dinner we drove round the vicinity, past Weltervreden, where are the barracks for the troops. The situation is considered salubrious. There is also a fine building at this place, used as the staterooms for the governor, and some part of it for government offices. Opposite to this building, in the centre of the square, is a small column surmounted by a lion, erected in commemoration of the Battle of Waterloo. I was much gratified during the drive with the neat appearance of the houses, most of which were surrounded by gardens, rendered both brilliant and fragrant by tropical trees and shrubs, gay with the vivid colouring imparted by their blossoms, and, as evening closed, the powerful and delicious odour of the tuberose, which bears the appellation of intriguer of the night among the Malays, communicated to us the information that those simple white liliaceous flowers were growing not far distant. In a few of the gardens I remarked that curious large herbaceous plant called the traveller's tree, from a refreshing stream of limpid water gushing out from the stem when cut. It is rare and not indigenous, I understand, to Java. I recollect first seeing this tree at the Mauritius, and think it was mentioned as having been brought from Madagascar. The native houses in the vicinity of Batavia are almost concealed by the luxuriant foliage of coconut, banana, jack, and other tropical trees. A neat building we passed, I was informed, was the English Church, and is under the direction of the Reverend Mr. Medhurst. After extending our drive round the König, or King's Plain, we returned to our hotel. In the billiard room I remarked a Javanese of diminutive stature, but stoutly formed, with a noble intellectual head. His manner was free and independent, but at the same time pleasing. He was accompanied by a young lad, his brother-in-law. This individual turned out to be no other than the celebrated chief Santot, or, as at present known by his assumed name, Ali Basa. He was a leader of the rebellious party during the late insurrections under Diepo Nagoro, and by going over to the Dutch was the means of bringing the late Javanese war to a favourable issue. Since that time he has held the rank of colonel in the Dutch service, with the command of 800 native troops, and has recently been sent on the expedition to Padang in Sumatra, where the Dutch are making strenuous efforts to conquer and oppress the natives. Santot, or Panjarang Ali Basa Pranredo Jujo, was attired in white trousers, waistcoat, and a coat of blue cloth with gilt buttons. He wore also a turban in the usual Javanese style. His brother-in-law was dressed in a blue cloth jacket and trousers. The intellectual head and intelligent countenance of Santot would induce one to regard him as a second Napoleon. As I have just stated, he was one of the leaders in the late rebellion, and made strenuous exertions to expel the oppressors of his country. This was nearly effected when he attacked a Monsieur Delot, then a lieutenant commanding a small fortress in the interior of Java, with a small garrison of only 20 European soldiers, but who were well supplied with arms and ammunition. Ali Basa made the attack with a strong force, but after losing 50 men, he forwarded a message to Lieutenant Delot, to the effect that if he would come alone to him, he would make conditions to surrender himself to the Dutch government. Lieutenant Delot, with some confidence, ventured. On being introduced, Ali Basa, who was seated on a mat, desired the lieutenant to sit down by him, and the interview terminated by Santot surrendering to him on condition that he should not be beheaded. Having entered the Dutch service, he was sent, with the regiment of native troops under his command, to the seat of war in the island of Sumatra. The cause of his return to Batavia was a suspicion entertained by the resident at Padang of his being in secret correspondence with the enemy, and the following stratagem was practised to convey him as a prisoner to Batavia. Santot was stationed at some distance from Padang with about 800 Javanese troops, and because he was not attacked by the natives at the time of the massacre, the Dutch at Padang suspected he must have had some knowledge of the preconcerted plan to destroy the European force. The resident, afraid to make any open charge against him, requested he would proceed to Java, at the earnest solicitations of the Governor-General, to collect a large force and return to conquer Sumatra. Upon this representation, he was induced to embark on board the government cruiser Circe. On landing at Batavia, he was received by the resident and a guard of cavalry, and proceeded in the governor's carriage, as he naturally supposed, to have an interview with His Excellency. But instead of it, he was conveyed to the common jail and there confined in a dungeon, ignorant even of the charges against him, and none of his friends were permitted to visit him. There he remained for several days, on suspicion. He was liberated on its being represented to the Governor-General that the resident of Padang was misinformed. It is said he is to return to Sumatra. He seemed to enjoy the game of billiards and was an expert player. His brother-in-law, who was second in command of the regiment, was at one time near falling a victim to the strict discipline Santot maintained in his army during the rebellion. Having issued orders against cockfighting and every other species of gambling, on going unexpectedly round the camp, he found his brother-in-law with some other officers thus engaged. He ordered them out to be shot. 3 were instantly killed, and the brother-in-law was saved by the ball carrying away his turban and producing a slight scalp wound, after which Santot pardoned him. Santot is a graceful horseman. The troops under his command consist of cavalry and infantry. The former are described as being a fine body of troops. They are dressed in the Moorish costume and armed with lances, sabres, carbines, and pistols. His army consisted of 5,000 men. Santot is not of noble family, although by his talents he has elevated himself to the rank of a Prince of Java. He now holds the station and receives the pay of a colonel in the Dutch service. I saw some of his infantry, who were fine-looking soldiers, attired in green turbans, blue uniform jacket and trousers, and handkerchiefs round their waists. The exactions of the Dutch government upon the natives have increased rather than diminished, in spite of all the lessons they have received, and the present system, if left unaltered, will eventually cause the loss of Java, if not the whole of their settlements in the eastern islands. At the present time, much discontent prevails at Makassar and other places, which, together with the attempts at aggrandisement in Sumatra, where a severer opposition is experienced than could ever have been expected, throws enough upon their hands in this part of the world. And when the news arrived of the late rupture in Holland, it was fully expected by the Javanese that the English would take the island, and the arrival in the roads of a British man of war, the Curaçao, was almost hailed by them as a confirmation of the fact. The government trembled for Java when the news of war in Europe arrived, and the appearance of our men of war, the Magicienne, Wolf, and etc., did not tend to allay their apprehensions. The Dutch vessels were sent off to Surabaya and remained there under the protection of the sloops of war Helden and Amphitrite. So there was hardly a single Dutch vessel remaining in Batavia roads, the English and American flags almost alone waving. The government were engaged in erecting 2 turf batteries on the banks, a short distance down the river, and planted cannon upon them, and mercantile affairs were almost suspended. It was expected that an embargo would have been laid by the Dutch on our ships in Batavia roads, but an order issued on this subject had reference only to their own vessels. The Calcutta and other papers were at this time filled with false and absurd statements relating to the Dutch force at Batavia, and seemed most eager to point out, even in the event of hostilities, in what manner they could most easily invade British property. In consequence of the present unsettled state of Holland, freights were difficult to be procured, although a large quantity of produce remained for shipment. But the owners were afraid to ship until news of a more settled state of European affairs arrived. Flour was scarce and maintained a high price at Batavia. Malay boatmen are employed for ships' boats in preference to the crew of the vessels, as the boat has to be tracked up the river, by which the Europeans would suffer much exposure to the sun. The natives, thus employed, are also spies of the custom house, and are ever on the watch, when unsuspected, and ready to convey information of any attempt to evade the duties. At the residence of Mr. Davies, I had an opportunity of seeing a living specimen of the orangutan, which had been brought from Banjarmasin on the south coast of Borneo. The animal was a male and measured 2 feet 4 inches in height, being the first specimen I had seen alive. I was much pleased with its intellectual appearance as compared with others of the monkey tribe. He was seen at some disadvantage, as he was suffering from a severe cold, and not being found in the usual haunt, was at last discovered in one of the beds, enveloped in a sheet. When we uncovered him, he regarded us with a piteous countenance, as if to inform us he was indisposed. His eyes were suffused with tears, cough, and skin very hot and dry, with a pulse at 120. What is the natural standard of the healthy pulse in this animal? He was evidently most desirous of being wrapped up, and did not care to be caressed by strangers, but turned his back upon them, hiding his head and face. His usual place of repose was on a mat in the veranda, but feeling ill, he thought he might claim greater indulgence, so took possession of one of the beds. The large anterior mass of brain gave a high degree of intelligence to the animal's countenance, although the face had not so much of the human character as seen in the Simnia syndactyla or unca ape. But, concealing the lower portion of the countenance, the upper part and eyes beam with an intelligent expression. I observe it can thrust forward the lips in imitation of the action of kissing, but cannot give the impulse to them. Neither does it lap liquid when in the act of drinking. When running about, it often exercises its destructive propensity by destroying trees in the gardens of the houses in the vicinity, and some of the owners, not evincing much partiality to the monkey tribe, threatened to shoot the aggressor. So, to save the life of the animal, a large bamboo cage was constructed, in which he was confined, but, born to freedom, he screamed with rage on being placed in it, and, exerting his muscular power, soon demolished the cage, and was then as quiet as before, being perfectly docile when at liberty, but savage under restraint. He sometimes made himself a nest in a large tree near the house, and, watching when anyone approached with fruit or eggs, would come down and endeavour to steal them. He is fond of coffee, and runs eagerly after the servants to procure it. The natives are very fond of the animal, and it appears more attached to them than to Europeans. Not being found in Java, it is regarded as a great curiosity, the natives assigning to it a superior degree of intelligence. The animal, having been presented to the commander of a ship to take to Europe, the servants declared that it had overheard the conversation of its being about to migrate, and always appeared melancholy whenever this gentleman visited the house, adding also that it was the cause of its present illness. The engraving of this animal in Dr. Abel's work on China was immediately recognized by the natives, and his interesting account accords with the generally observed habits. Excepting in intellectual development, I do not consider the orangutan so closely resembles the human species as the Hylobates syndactyla or unca ape, which walks more erect, and in its eternal anatomy is more closely allied to the human race. Being desirous of gaining some information respecting the usual height these animals attain, I consulted several persons who had visited Borneo, one of whom had been for some time a prisoner in the interior. The greatest elevation the animal had been seen was 4 feet 3 or 4 inches. At first it was stated to be 8 feet, but on further explanation it was found the animal had been measured with the arms elevated above the head, which of course made a material difference. Its most usual height is from 2.5 to 3 feet when erect. These animals can be procured with facility at Borneo for $1 or $2, but if not procured young, little dependence can be placed on their surviving, as they become so strongly attached to their masters that a separation will cause them to pine and die. The animal at Mr. Davis's improved in health in a few days, but never evinced any inclination to cultivate the acquaintance of strangers. He was much attached to a Malay female and a little Malay boy who resided in the same house with him, and the latter was his principal playmate. Society in Batavia is a dead letter. Bachelors' smoking and drinking parties are, in many instances, common, ruining the health and occasioning the death of many, particularly strangers. The cause of frequent mortality is, in many instances, attributed to climate, that should be laid to the charge of imprudence. From the little I saw of the Batavian ladies, when returning from church in their gay equipages, they were not particularly attractive. The majority were tinged with a dark hue, probably sunburnt. Few can talk any language but Javanese and Dutch, so there would be some difficulty for a stranger to judge of their intellectual powers. Bonnets not being fashionable in this country, an excellent view was afforded of their attractions. Some had 4 horses to their chariots, and a number of black servants perched up behind, according to the wealth or rank of the personage. The Chinese are the principal artificers of the place, the Javanese preferring a military life. The Chinese are also the cultivators of the plantations and manufacturers of sugar, etc. Many of them may now be seen driving about in their carriages, possessed of great wealth and owners of large estates, who arrived not many years since, penniless. Several large estates on the island are also owned by British subjects resident in England, having agents or superintendents here to look after them. Flowers of delicious fragrance are sold about the streets to adorn the dark forms of the Javanese females, or lavish their fragrance upon the fairer Batavians, who are extravagantly fond of this article of luxury. The animals of Java are very numerous, the island being rich in zoological and botanical productions. The small or Java rhinoceros is numerous about Seram, in the district of Bantam. It is often shot, but all endeavours to procure living specimens have as yet failed. Tigers are also numerous, and consist of 3 species, the Macan itum, or black tiger, the Macan totoil, or leopard, and the Macan loreng, or royal striped tiger. There are 2 species of doves seen in great numbers about the habitations of the Javanese, one being small, the other of a delicate cream colour, with a narrow black semicircular mark about the neck. The small species, which is most esteemed, is called pekutut by the Javanese, and the larger one, puta. Conversing with a Javanese about them, he appeared delighted to give me some account of his pets. Seeing them attended with so much care, I inquired the reason of their being such favourites, in preference to birds of far more beautiful plumage, so abundant on this magnificent and fertile island. In answer to my inquiry, he informed me that, when these birds are kept about the house, it will not be destroyed by fire or be liable to the depredations of thieves. As an instance of their having this power, should I be sceptical on the subject, he gravely assured me that during the heavy rains in February 1832, when most of the houses were inundated, one was preserved from the flood by this bird being within. The water flowed round the habitation, but did not enter. When the birds are kept in a state of confinement, it is said by the Javanese that they pass small green stones, sometimes one every week, and continuing for 1 or 2 years. These stones are much esteemed, valued as high as 30 and 40 rupees each, and are set in rings, etc. The stones, according to native information, are always passed upon a Friday, which is the Javanese Sunday. Some set as high a value upon their birds as 50 and 100 rupees each. The natives never eat them. A European at one time shot some and gave them to his Javanese servant to eat, not being aware of their veneration for them, but he would not touch them. Every Friday they take the birds out of the cages, wash them in rice water, at the same time administering some small pills, composed of such a multiplicity of medicinal ingredients that my Javanese informant said it would take too long a time to give me the names of the whole. Otherwise the birds would not live, for if they were not washed and did not take the physic, they would have small white worms in the corner of the eyes and in the nostrils, which would soon destroy them. Yesterday, Friday, said my amusing Malay informant, I washed this bird, the one then before us, and gave him his physic. He was so highly pleased at my taking an interest in his birds that he presented me with a pair of the cream-coloured doves, which, he observed, would speak like a clock every hour. The smaller species was the one, however, possessed of the preserving qualities against fire and flood. He apologised for not making me a present of it, and gave, in my opinion, the best of reasons that a married man could, which was, his wife would not let him part with it. I, however, so pleased my Malay friends that he regretted I was about to leave Batavia so soon, as he would otherwise have shown me some more curiosities, and given me plenty of information on Javanese things. Probably, I thought, of a similar stamp to the foregoing, that is more amusing than instructive. He brought me a dried specimen of the hippocampus, carefully wrapped in paper. It was named ikan kudu, or horsefish, ikan signifying a fish, and kudu, horse, by the Malays, from its being regarded by them as an excellent medicine for horses. They place it, without being pounded or otherwise prepared, in the water the horses drink, and consider it an excellent tonic for them. I saw at Batavia a species of gibbon, which is indigenous to Java, and had just been purchased. It was the Pithecus leuciscus, or Simia leuciscia, Shreb. The natives call it the white ape, or woa woa pute. The fur being of a light greyish colour, face and ears black, no tail, long arms, and a prehensile power of the feet. The sumpitan, or blowpipe, is an instrument upwards of 6 feet long, with which the Javanese propel small clay pellets from the mouth with such force as to kill birds and other animals. They are likewise used by the Javanese in warfare to shoot the small poisoned arrows, damkhak, which are about a foot in length, armed at one extremity with pith, and are propelled with surprising accuracy of aim. End of section 18.
Section 19 of Wanderings in New South Wales, Batavia, Pedir Coast, Singapore and China, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wanderings in New South Wales, Batavia, Pedir Coast, Singapore and China, Volume 1, by George Bennett. Chapter 19. At daylight on the 2nd of June, I left Batavia for the Pedir Coast, on the north-east part of the large island of Sumatra, and about noon, it being calm, anchored off Huon Island, in the Great Channel. This island is a mere reef, or sandbank, with trees of some elevation upon it, which impart a higher aspect to it than on landing it is in reality found to possess. The passage by the western coast of Sumatra was tedious, light and variable winds and calms being very often experienced, although we kept some 100 of miles from the coast. It was, therefore, not until the morning of the 28th of June that elevated land was seen, being the islands about the Bengal Passage, which we entered about 10:30 a.m., having on one side the lofty wooded island of Pulo Bras and Pulo Nancy, and opposite to them the elevated island rich in vegetation of Pulo Way. Pulo Rondo was also visible in the distance. Our progress through the passage was but slow, with a moderate south wind and a strong westerly current considerably impeded the vessel. On entering further in the passage, we became more under the influence of the high land, and the breeze diminished. The weather was showery and unsettled, and the ship anchored in the evening in Guinguion Roads, in 11 fathoms, about 5 or 6 miles distant from the wooded coast. The land had a lofty aspect, abounding in profuse vegetation, and was possessed of much romantic and picturesque beauty. Since we entered the passage and proceeded along the coast, the mountains rose in peaked and various fantastic groups, forming the back view of the landscape. The low land near the beach was covered with timber. Hills rose gradually one beyond another, terminated by lofty mountains, towering in the distance, the whole covered by a dense vegetation. At this time the view was occasionally impeded by fleecy clouds passing over, giving afterwards an increased animated appearance to the scene by the refreshing showers they produced. At some distance from the mainland, straggling rocks were sometimes seen, either rising solitary or in clusters from the ocean's depths, some covered with a scanty vegetation, whilst the bare summits and declivities of others had a volcanic character. Around their bases the breakers dashed furiously, and the white foam raged against those rugged sides, which had stood the violence of 1,000 tempests, serving as a place of refuge for boobies, tropic and other oceanic birds, which here congregate and rear their progeny free from molestation. The coast, as we proceeded, maintained its picturesque character, the high land being clothed with timber, and the low coast trending between the more elevated parts, of a somewhat similar character to some portions of the island of Java and other islands of the Indian archipelago, was profusely covered with vegetation. On Pulo Way several clear and apparently cultivated patches of land were visible, and smoke of fires, but no habitations could be perceived. Most of the island was a dense jungle, seeming only calculated as a refuge for wild animals in the midst of its wilderness of luxuriant vegetation. The coast of which we had anchored this evening was, for the most part, low, except the land being elevated as it rose from the Point Pedro, but it was not of such a verdant character as the mountainous coast we had previously passed during the day. The low land, however, abounded in trees, among which the cocoa-nut palm was both numerous and conspicuous. The following morning, at sunrise, the atmosphere was delightfully cool and refreshing, and the land breeze brought off with it a delicious fragrance. At daylight we weighed past Point Pedro, and then the vessel sailed at a distance only of 3 miles from the shore, in from 12 to 14 fathoms of water, which afforded an excellent view of the varying features of the Archinese coast, as we proceeded. During the early part of the morning, the towering peaked summit of the Golden Mountains was visible and perfectly clear, but as the day advanced it became capped with clouds. It was elevated far above the mountains in the vicinity, and seemed situated some distance inland. The west side of the mountain was clothed with wood to the summit, and exhibits nothing in its aspect from which the name of Golden could be supposed to be derived, but as the Malays term it the Gunung Mas, or Golden Mountain, it has probably obtained the appellation from them on account of gold having been found upon it, and the English name is merely a translation of the Malay. The eastern side of the mountain has a similar densely wooded appearance from the base to the summit, as just mentioned of the western. The morning was fine and clear, and as we sailed along the high picturesque coast of this portion, northeast of the beautiful island of Sumatra, with light and variable winds from west-southwest to northwest, it was extremely agreeable, but at the same time often caused me to feel regret that I could not revel amidst the botanical and other natural productions the coast and adjacent hills seemed to produce in profusion. Besides the elevated Golden Mountain, there were many of great height, some of a saddle form, and the crateric summits of others, imparted additional importance to the beautiful romantic scenery around them. The hills became less wooded as we advanced to the eastward and lost much of their tropical character. This peculiar feature of the country was, however, occasionally resumed. A sandy beach upon which large trees were scattered, with a few thatched habitations of the natives, peeping from the dense foliage of the trees which grew about, with the cocoa-nut palms waving their feathered branches above them. This again gave the tropical character to our view, but the receding hills terminating in mountainous country, now but thinly covered with vegetation, varied the landscape, and it possessed little to remind the stranger of intertropical scenery. It was soon after noonday when we passed the bluff point named in the charts the Lover's Leap, and the coast beyond maintained for some distance similar features to that we had passed, excepting some portions which had an increase of picturesque beauty. The receding hills were not so elevated. White cliffs, bare of shrubs or any kind of vegetation, rose almost perpendicularly from the beach about the Lover's Leap. But still further eastward the coast again abounded in trees. Hills rose above hills, having in part a cleared appearance, but in general vegetation was most abundant. Lofty mountains formed the distant prospect, above the whole of which the Golden Mountain reared its peaked summit, terminating the rich and varied landscape in an extremely beautiful manner. From the few houses and canoes seen about this part of the coast, there seems to be a paucity of inhabitants, and no cultivation of the land was visible. The natives, however, may live in the fertile valleys a short distance from the sea-coast, and concealed from our view. The wind and current being averse, it was impossible for the ship to make any progress, and we therefore anchored about 7 p.m. in 12 fathoms, a few miles to the eastward of the Lover's Leap. The next day we proceeded along the coast, the features of which were similar to that before described, but beyond Pedir Point the country assumed a more populous and cultivated appearance. Cocoa palms abounded on the beach, thatched houses of the natives were numerous, and canoes and larger boats were busily fishing. The whole aspect of the coast was animated and picturesque. From light winds and calms and strong adverse currents, we were often obliged to anchor, and did not reach the anchorage of the village of Pedir until the afternoon of the subsequent day, the 1st of July. The situation of Pedir is an extensive, fertile flat, interspersed with low, verdant hills, and the distance terminating in lofty mountains, covered most profusely with vegetation. The village of Pedir, from which some extent of coast to the eastward has been named by Europeans the Pedir coast, is situated a short distance up a small and narrow river. The residence of the Rajah and a portion of the village could be distinguished from the shipping in the roadstead. The plain through which the river flows, and upon the banks of which the village of Pedir is situated, is an extensive flat, or for the most part a series of marshes abounding in rice plantations, and extending to some distance inland, apparently terminated by a dense jungle and ranges of mountains towering one above the other. To the westward it becomes hilly, trending out towards Pedir Point, and to the eastward terminates in lofty mountains at some distance. This description is given from the appearance of the country as seen from the anchorage. The whole line of coast has a beautiful and luxuriant character, abounding in coconut, areca, and other palms, and beneath the trees the thatched roofs of native houses are occasionally seen. Some vessels belonging to the Rajah of Achin were at anchor off Pedir, and others, having English colours flying, off the villages further to the eastward. The ships belonging to the Achinese Rajah were designated men of war, but a grab among the number was the only one originally the property of His Highness, for it had just conquered the bark, at whose peak the Achinese colours waved, but which had been the property of the Rajah of Trumong, who resided on the west coast of Sumatra, and with whom the Achinese monarch was at war. The remaining one, under the Achinese flag, was an English brig of Penang, last from the Maldive Islands, with the cargo of dried fish. She was seized for trading in arms and ammunition with the Rajah on the coast, who was at the time hostile to the King of Achin. I shall have occasion to return to the latter affair in another part of this work. The vessels were rigged in the European style, appeared of English build, and carried guns like merchant ships. They hoisted a huge broad red pennant, and the Achinese ensign, the field of which was red, the central ornaments of a white colour. Soon after we anchored, an old Mormon came off the ship from the Rajah, and arrangements were made to accompany him on shore the next morning to pay our respects to His Highness. On the morning of the following day I accompanied Mr. Henry Fearon, the supercargo, and the commander on a visit to the shore to have an interview with the Rajah, one of his attendants having previously been on board, bearing a multitude of salams from His Highness, and intimating that he would be happy to receive the gentleman arrived in the ship. At the entrance of the river we crossed the bar, upon which a surf is continually breaking, more violently at low water, or when the sea breeze blows fresh, than at high water. At this time there was comparatively but little surf, so we passed without getting wet. We then entered the small winding river, which, although deep at some parts, suddenly shoaled at others, except the channel was kept, which usually had a sufficient draught of water for light boats. But an inexperienced person had better have a native to pilot him, which prevents the annoyance of continually getting the boat perched upon spits and sandbanks. The course of the river is very serpentine, and after entering it, the banks are covered with shrubs and plants, forming a dense vegetation among the Acanthus ilicifolia, covered by a profusion of cerulean blossoms, and other flowering shrubs were numerous, as also the Acrosticum aureum and other ferns. Native houses appeared mingled with the graceful waving bamboo, cocoa palms, plantains, and other trees. After proceeding a short distance up the river, we arrived at the small village of Pedir, which is a collection of thatched Malay habitations. Herds of buffalo were refreshing themselves in the stream, and had a strange appearance when seen with only the head above water. The natives informed us that alligators were numerous in the river. We did not observe any during the time we remained at Pedir, but from the buffaloes not being attacked, it is probable they are not numerous about the lower part of the river. After bathing, the buffaloes, not being troubled with many of the projections called hairs, had their hides covered with a thick coating of blue mud, which preserved them from the attacks of insects. Those on the banks, both old and young, stood with their ludicrous physiognomies staring at us as we passed them. A number of the small humpbacked Bengal breed of cattle were also observed feeding about the plain. On leaving the ship, arms had been placed in the boat as a precautionary measure on this coast, where the natives are reported to be oftentimes unable to distinguish between meum and tuum. But on landing they were left in the boat, and our Jacks, not having the fear of the natives, or of a reprimand from their commander, before their eyes, took a morning's walk about the village, leaving the boat, together with our weapons, under charge of a boy, which proved the precaution was needless, as the arms reposing at the bottom of the boat were in this instance equally as ineffective as if they had been in the hands of the men. After landing, we were conducted through an extensive bazaar, planted with several shady trees, called ba, asan, by the natives, the closeness of their foliage and extending branches affording an agreeable shelter from the fervour of the sun's rays. The market seemed well supplied. We were conducted from this to the hall of reception for strangers, which was a small room elevated a short distance above the ground, opened on all sides with an ornamental projecting roof. The ascent to it was by a rude bamboo ladder, like an approach to a hayloft, but as the Rajah ascended by the same staircase, of course we could not complain. On entering the room we found some chairs of European manufacture, standing on 4 legs, but most of them minus arms, backs, etc., In these we were requested to seat ourselves until the Rajah arrived. Some coarse mats were also laid upon the floor in the centre of the room, or perhaps cage would be a better nomenclature than room, for it was more like the latter than the former. We waited patiently the arrival of the Rajah for some time, surrounded and gazed at by several old, grave-looking, bearded Moormen, who remained silent, as their organs of mastication were almost incessantly engaged in chewing the betel, their teeth being blackened, and lips become of a brick-red colour, from the use of this masticatory. It is said that it is a good stomachic, causing the breath to be always sweet, and the assertion may be correct, for the breath of the natives who are in the habit of chewing the aromatic compound is agreeable, but the discoloration of the teeth and mouth caused by its use gives a disagreeable appearance to those who habituate themselves to it. Whilst delayed by the Rajah, we were regaled by the pure and refreshing juices from some green coconuts. At length his Highness arrived. He was a young man of very dark but handsomely formed features, darker by 2 shades than the Malays, about 5 feet 5 or 6 inches in height, of slender form, and attired in the usual sarong, a yellow silk sandalong or sash around the waist, in which a kriss of handsome manufacture was placed. A close baju or jacket, with plated buttons in front, upon his head a turban of white cloth without any decorations, and gold bangles around his wrists and ankles. His attendants were almost all Moormen, or natives of Bengal and Madras, many from the latter countries, and others of that extraction born at this place. The Rajah, although born here, had the appearance of being of Bengal parentage. The grave old gentlemen around were the principal spokesmen on affairs of business. It was the object of Mr. Fearon to purchase a cargo of areca nut for the China market, for which object he had brought dollars, opium, iron, lead, and steel. Most of the bearded gentlemen were traders in the areca nut, but a tall, thin, elderly, and shrewd old man was the principal agent in the transactions between Mr. Fearon and the Rajah, for the latter, like most Rajahs, had but little to say on the affair, and, from being young, had merely to approve of whatever was done. This agent, whom we designated Minister of the Board of Trade, proved to be uncle to the present Rajah. This circumstance accounted for his having so much to do with the government affairs. After some commonplace conversation, the commercial business was introduced, samples or musters of the quality of the nuts were shown, and an arrangement was entered into between the parties for the delivery of 3,000 pekels in 10 days, at the rate of $1.50 the pekel, iron, steel, lead, and dollars being given in exchange, at prices then agreed upon. The contract was ratified by the old trading minister, placing his right hand of the supercargo into that of the Rajah, repeating, as they remained with joined hands, the terms assented to. All agreements are made in the name of the Rajah, and are written and signed by both parties. They had abundance of opium, as much, they informed us, as 700 chests unsold. It had been purchased at $700 the chest, the cost price at Batavia at this time, but the areca nut had been delivered in exchange at the rate of $1 the pekel. After the commercial affairs had been settled, the Rajah, ministers, and merchants accompanied us about, and in the vicinity of the village, followed by a nondescript rabble. My collecting plants and insects amused some and puzzled others, and all were desirous of ascertaining for what purpose I required them, whether we had any flowers in our country, whether they were to feed animals, and the insects for birds on board the ship. But when at last they were informed I was a curer of diseases, they remained perfectly satisfied that I collected them for medicinal purposes, and without making another inquiry on the subject, resumed their almost perpetual conversation on the areca or betel nut. On the way the Rajah gathered a plant, Chenopodium family, and giving it to me said it was medicinal and called it by the Malays Gunche Maju, signifying shirt buttons, and the name was probably applied to it from the elevated buds having some resemblance to them. The plant is used by the natives in the form of decoction as an internal remedy for various diseases, and as far as I could understand them, was possessed of emetic properties. It is a small plant and grows abundantly on the banks of the paddy fields and on most of the wasteland about the village. Among a profusion of other flowering shrubs and plants was the Cassia occidentalis, bandrum of the natives, several species of Solanium, and pretty Vinca rosea, or rose periwinkle, Datura fastuosa, the fruit of which the natives told me would cause madness if eaten. It was named by them Tropungo. Several species of convolvoli, a species of Senecio, with a number of others, wild and cultivated, some of which exhaled fragrant odours, and a multitude of butterflies and other insects, vying with one another in brilliancy and harmony of colours, flew about in apparent enjoyment of the fervent tropical sun, among the profusion of flowers which strewed the ground. The Jatropha curcas, or banawa, of the natives was planted, as well as the bamboo for fences. Rice fields were numerous, but this being the dry season, the fields were dry, and the harvest collected. The variety of succulent and other plants that sprung up about them afforded excellent feeding for the numerous herds of cattle rambling about. During the rainy season, which occurs from about November to nearly the termination of the month of February, the planting of rice takes place. The fields, for the most part dry at the present time, are then overflown. The season of the rice harvest usually occurs in April. The country, although flat, had a pleasing, fertile aspect, and when the vivid green or golden yellow of the rice plantation was added, its beauty must be still further increased. The Rajah, his followers, and the merchants appear to be all Moormen, neither natives of or descendants from those born in Hindostan. The bazaar trade appears for the most part also to be monopolized by them. The Malays seem the tillers of the soil, or subordinates in other respects. The Hindustani natives, or their descendants, are evidently the conquerors of the coast, and of course the heads of government are of that race. The Rajah made Mr. Fearon a present of the small bullock, coconuts, plantains, sugar canes, etc., and accepted an invitation to visit the ship the day following, when it would be requisite, from their professing the Mahometan creed, that all pigs should be kept from grunting, or getting an afternoon's liberty. About noon, taking leave of the Rajah and his party, we returned on board. At this place no canoes came off to the ship with fish, fowls, fruit, etc., for sale. None but those on business came to the ship, and Mr. Fearon was advised by the Rajah not to allow any to do so. This appeared strange, as for off other villages to the eastward of Pedir, goats, fruit, fowls, yams, etc., were brought off for sale. But we afterwards had good reason for suspecting that some of the Rajah's followers were desirous of supplying the ship, placing their own prices on the articles, allowing a percentage to His Highness, and thus contrived to have a prohibition placed on canoes coming alongside. End of section 19.
Chapter 20 of Wanderings in New South Wales, Batavia, Pedir Coast, Singapore and China, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wanderings in New South Wales, Batavia, Pedir Coast, Singapore and China, Volume 1 by George Bennett. Chapter 20. On the afternoon of the following day, we had the honour of a visit from the young Rajah. He came off in one of the large native boats, seated upon a platform on the stern, in the Oriental fashion. Having no state boat, he came in this, which was merely one of the usual cargo, or fishing boats, which are large and spacious, with a small deck or platform at the after part. Many of the rowers were attired in scarlet jackets, some having, and others being deficient in, sleeves, and all seemed to have dressed themselves in their best apparel. All wore elegant krises, for the whole of the natives, whether of the Malay or Hindostani races, wear the kris or the klawang, a kind of short sword, and are seldom or never seen without. The manufacture of these weapons varies in both the blades and handles, and all the varieties are designated by distinct native names. From the form of the blades, severe wounds must be caused by them, and many of the natives wore scars obtained by them in their private quarrels. The handles were formed of whale's teeth or buffalo horn, and the sheaths of various beautiful woods, of which a kind of satin wood seemed to have the preference. The wood is said not to be luted together, nor has it the appearance of being so, in the construction of the sheath, but is hollowed in an ingenious manner from a solid piece, and is very liable to split with the least blow. They are tastefully ornamented with a kind of tatauing, or carving, performed with a small knife, into which, after the carving is completed, some black pigment is rubbed, which gives an increased effect to the decoration. They place a high value on the krises and klawangs, and they are usually ornamented with gold or silver, according to the rank and wealth of the owner. The cutting portion of the blade is formed of steel, the remainder of iron. The temper of the weapons is not good, being extremely brittle. The Rajah was attired in the same apparel as on our interview yesterday, but his followers formed, in dress, a motley group. There was a fine-looking lad, about 14 years of age, who came with the party. He was step-brother to the Rajah, or, as we were informed by a Mormon who spoke some English, one father, two mothers, Rajah, and this boy. He was dressed in a scarlet jacket, decorated with gold lace, a handsome kris, and wore gold bangles around his ankles. The young Rajah ran about the ship, seeming to enjoy all he beheld, mistook the Sow, who behaved remarkably well on this occasion, neither grunting nor giving any indications of the suspicious family to which she belonged, but sat upon her haunches, gazing unmeaningly at the visitors, who held her race in abhorrence, for a kind of dog, and was delighted with the turkeys, which he had never seen before. A pair of the birds were presented to him, and also a sheep, at which he was much gratified. Our thin spare friend, the trading minister, and also a train of attendants and merchants, accompanied the Rajah. The former antiquated personage brought with him his son, a little boy of about 4 or 5 years old. He was a keen, black-eyed little fellow, wore a Mormon's cap elegantly worked with gold lace on his little shaved cranium, a scarlet jacket and trousers, a number of gold and silver bangles about his wrists and ankles, and an amulet or charm, which consists of a sentence from the Koran written and placed in a case to protect the wearer from injury. The priests make it a good harvest in this kind of traffic, which appears to me strictly analogous to the African fetishes. Pended from his neck. The dark, diminutive creature chattered incessantly, and was inquisitive about everything it saw, appeared devoid of fear, and was quite tame, suffering itself to be handled with impunity. After all our sable visitors had concluded their rambles over, and inspection of, the ship, they were invited into the cuddy. Seated round the table, and cabin biscuit and cheese were placed before them. They evinced some partiality to the former, by devouring large quantities themselves, and passing supplies to the numerous attendants who could not feed at the table. They could not be induced thus publicly to taste wine or beer, being against the Mahometan creed, but preferred cocoa-nut water, which they said is our wine and beer. But few would refuse either wine or spirits in private. I amused them with some drawings. Among others, they recognised that of the pearly Nautilus, but said it was rarely procured at this place, but was occasionally seen off the coast. They named it sea shrimp, udang laut, udang shrimp, and laut sea. They were not acquainted with the orangutan, of which I showed them an engraving, but immediately knew that of the Hybolaites syndactyla, or Ungca ape, which, they observed, was found in the woods of the interior of this island, but was very difficult to capture alive. The Rajah, having remained for some time on board, retired with his attendants to the boat, and returned on shore, under a salute of 3 guns from the ship, which compliment he also received on coming on board. The Rajah of Pedir is related to the king of Achin, and the territory is tributary to the Achinese ruler. The population of the Pedir district, which does not extend far along the coast, but to some distance inland, is stated to be 100,000, and has several petty Rajahs tributary to it, but they appear all petty Rajahs along this coast, paying homage and tribute to the Achinese king. Often during the cool evenings, I amused myself by wandering about the extensive beach on this coast, to observe and collect such marine productions as might be interesting. A great number of dead shells strewed the beach, but living shells, or those containing the soft parts, were rare. Observing an antenna of some crustaceous animal projecting from the moist sand, left by the receding of the tide, I pulled it, and drew out 2 fine king crabs, joined together by their under surfaces, and thus united burrow in the sand. They are called Ekan Mimi by the Javanese, and on this coast they are named Moi Moi. The male is larger than the female. They are eaten by the Javanese, but on this coast they are not eaten, although the natives observe the Chinese are fond of them. The females lay their eggs in the sand after carrying them for some time, and in about the 2nd month the young are produced. These animals are perfectly harmless. They crawl rapidly, and when touched, draw the upper part of the shell a little inwards, and, as they move, the long antenna bears a resemblance to a tail. When placed on the back, they find much difficulty in regaining their natural position. Land crabs were numerous, as were also the shells of the genera Synthera, Telina, Mactra, Conus, Oliver, Cypria, Harper, Dolium, Murex, Turbo, Narita, and Dentalium. But although this was an indication of the number about the coast, yet but very few were procured in which the living animals were found. Among these were a number of the Venus, and small species of Voluta. The latter buried themselves with rapidity in the sand. The natives call them Dunkin. Almost buried in a deep black mud, among which the roots of mangrove trees abounded, the trees having been cut down, I found a number of white bodies growing from a piece of rotten wood, and being each about an inch in length and 3/8 of an inch in breadth, containing a watery fluid called sepa by the natives. They were not, however, eaten or used for any purpose by them. I preserved several specimens in spirits. A great number of the paguri, hermit or soldier crabs of different sizes, were running about the beach. 2 large specimens that I found had each taken possession of the Dolium perdix, or partridge shell, to which they were firmly attached as if in their natural habitation. The crustaceous portion of these animals is of a beautiful lilac colour, the softer parts yellow, and the antennae of a dark red colour. The natives call them by the general name of sipo. The smaller kind inhabit Murisus, Trochi, Neridi, Helisus, Limni, Cerathy, and other univalve shells. In some instances, I saw large shells of harper, etc., inhabited by very small animals of this kind, moving their heavy and cumbrous dwelling slowly and with difficulty. There were some of a red and others of a sea green colour, but the larger were invariably of a beautiful lilac. May not this change of colour depend upon their age? The paguri feed upon dead animals, fish, and all kinds of offal, as well as vegetable matter, such as skins of plantains, remains of cocoa nuts, fruits, etc. I have often observed a number of these creatures of various sizes congregated about a dead and putrid fish, and it is ludicrous, on disturbing them in the midst of their feast, to see them marching away, jumbling and overturning one another in the hurry, causing a clattering noise to proceed from the collision of their burrowed coverings. And should they not be able to escape capture, they draw themselves closely into the shell, closing the aperture so firmly by crossing the claws over the entrance as to render it impossible to extract them without breaking the shell to pieces. Thus secured, they remain immovable and apparently dead, and may be kicked or thrown about without giving any indications of life. But danger past, they emerge partly from the shell as before, and move briskly away. The natives use them occasionally, but rarely, as food. It is not an improbable supposition that the ova of these curious crustaceous animals are deposited in the empty shells lying upon the beach, and the changes these crustacea undergo is one of the most interesting subjects of investigation which could engage the attention of a practical naturalist. It is a curious fact that, no matter whatever form the univalve shell may have, the posterior or softer parts of the animal inhabiting it are accommodated to it, thus causing persons not accustomed to observe the changes of natural objects to regard this as the original inhabitant, and it is oftentimes difficult to persuade them to the reverse. The posterior portion of the animal being naked, and the anterior crustaceous, the former evidently requires some protection. One morning, having previously received a general invitation, I visited the Rajah at his habitation. The situation was an extensive plot of ground, containing numerous houses in the usual Malay style of building, being the residences of the Rajah, his wives, and attendants. The whole enclosed by lofty waving bamboos, forming a close and impenetrable fence, and the interior planted with a number of fruit trees and flowering shrubs. The entrance was by a gateway, over which was a small room, in which His Highness receives visitors, or whiles away in a leisure hour in smoking, talking, or sleeping. I ascended to it by a bamboo ladder and found myself in a cool but dirty room containing a small bed over which a mat was laid. The curtains about it seemed to have remained in ignorance, since they came from the loom of the application of water. Some carved boxes, one of which served me for a seat, a native shield, and a few other trumpery articles, constituted the furniture of the apartment. And here I was received in a cordial manner by the Rajah. His Highness was attired in a common Madras cloth sarong and sandalong, which, like the curtains, seemed never to have undergone ablution. He wore, in lieu of a turban, the usual parti-coloured Mormon's cap or kupiya, which merely covered the top of his head. The personal appearance of the Rajah reminded me of the tribe of animals they abhor for uncleanness. I allude to the hog, of which he informed us there were plenty wild, if we were desirous of hunting them. Cocoa-nut water was introduced, being the usual beverage in the country, and proving both wholesome and refreshing. The cocoa palm abounds, and they have numerous varieties. The Malay name for the nut is kalapas. In the Achinese language, the tree is called ba-hu, ba signifying tree, and hu, cocoa-nut. A ripe nut, hu masa, and a green one, hu muda. This palm forms a beautiful and picturesque object in the tropical landscape. In the appendix, I purpose giving an account of this valuable, ornamental, and useful palm, and the various uses for which it is employed in the different countries where it abounds. The habitations in the Rajah's enclosure were raised from the ground, which is the usual Malay style of constructing houses, and were ascended by means of rude bamboo ladders. They are formed, for the most part, of bamboo, and thatched with palm leaves. But one of larger size and neater style was the immediate residence of the Rajah and his wives, the young Rajah having, as we were informed, 2 concubines, 18 years of age each, and a child, now 4 years old, betrothed to him as his intended wife. Near the habitations, the cocoa, plantain, orange, mango, and custard apple trees grew, shading them by the grandeur and profusion of their foliage. There was also a house, which from the commencement, being now in frame, appeared intended to be of some extent, but which had been commenced by the old Rajah not long before his death. But the building was obliged to be discontinued by the young Rajah on his succession, from a want of the necessary funds for its construction. At one part of the enclosure a bamboo ladder ascended to a little elevation, which brought us to a plank over which we passed into the fort adjoining the residence of the Rajah, and was mounted with several large brass guns, most of which had the arms of the East India Company upon them. The fort was built of stone, elevated about 16 or 18 feet from the ground, covered over with a thatch of palm leaves, and having a lookout house upon the summit. There were lamps, which are lighted after dark, and remained so during the night, a sentinel being also stationed there. From some large rents in the walls of the fort, it was evident that the concussion of the guns, if fired off, which they had not yet been, would bring the whole fabric down about their ears. The minister and authorities thought the same, and said a stronger fort was to be built, when a sufficient number of stones calculated for the purpose could be collected. Although abundance of cocoa-nut water was given us to drink, yet nothing was offered us to eat, by which I should infer they conceived white people lived, like hummingbirds, upon suction. On leaving the Rajah's place, my guides took me again to the bazaar, where it appears to be accustomed to take strangers. This I attribute to their Mahometan prejudices of not being desirous of receiving Christians under their roofs. Here mats were placed, so that I could be seated and gazed at like a curious animal, by a large crowd of natives of all classes and orders, who, from the eagerness they evinced, and the crowds which they assembled around us upon these occasions, seemed to regard Europeans as curiosities. However, instead of waiting to be gazed at, I amused myself by wandering over the bazaar, which was plentifully supplied with sugar canes, plantains, rice, cucumbers, dried fish, sia, the leaf of the piper betel, the areca nut, or pinong, cut up ready for mastication, and a quantity of live stock, as small bullocks, ducks, fowls, etc., etc. From the bazaar I walked down by the banks of the river, upon the raised paths which intersected the numerous marshes, which now, during the dry season, abounded in luxuriant grasses and other herbaceous plants, affording fine feeding for the numerous bullocks of the small hunchbacked Bengal breed, and buffaloes, which roamed about. During the rainy season, the whole of this flat is planted with rice, which, together with the scattered picturesque habitations and groups of palms and other trees, form, by their combination, a very pleasing landscape. Upon the banks of the river was acrostic humorium, or ongpi, of the natives, as well as the bar jurugu, or Acanthus illicifolius, covered with a profusion of blue flowers, and brilliant butterflies and other insects flew about the rich vegetation which was so profusely strewn about. Surrounding a hut near the river was the sekar, a species of pandanus, the younger leaves of which several women were engaged in collecting. They are bleached by soaking in water, and afterwards exposing them to the heat of the sun. Being thus prepared, they manufacture them into various kinds of coarse mats. The Thespesia populnea, profusely covered with its large yellow flowers, and called onseron by the natives, was very common about their habitations, forming usually a portion of the fence around their gardens. A leafless species of the Euphorbiaceae family, which they named boogar, was also growing plentifully in the hedges. They did not use it medicinally, but said, if the juice was taken internally, it would produce violent pain and excessive vomiting. Having arrived at a fisherman's station, we crossed over a creek in one of the large fishing boats, in which the seine was very large, and manufactured from the fibres of the trunk of a palm, which I shall hereafter have occasion to mention. This fibrous material is known by the common name of black coir. It is strong, elastic, and very durable. A number of natives were fishing upon the banks of the river with their peculiar hand nets, called niap. This net is of a similar appearance, but of course smaller, to that used in the Sarambo fishing rafts at Manila, of which there is a very correct figure in the Voyage of La Pérouse.
Octavo, English edition.
Volume 2, page 322. On examining the contents of the baskets, which were rudely formed from the spathe of the areca palm. They were found to contain only a few small fish, prawns, and beongs, or crabs. On their success, my native attendants informed me, the fishermen depend for their daily meal. During the rice and betel nut harvest, they earn their subsistence by cutting and threshing the former, and gathering and shelling the latter. But when the season for those productions has passed, they depend upon the fish caught with the hand net as a subsistence for themselves and families. I stood by one of them to see a haul. After a short time had elapsed, the heavy net was raised, and contained only a solitary fish and a few crabs. The nets were baited with crabs' claws, tied about different parts. On a marsh near this spot, a flock of two kinds of crane was feeding. One species small and white, and named ekua. The other much larger, of a greyish colour, and named nugna nugna by the natives. Fruit was at this season scarce. A few guavas, plantains, and jack was all that could be procured. But during the season, mangoustines, a variety of plantains and bananas, oranges, pineapples, mangoes, and other tropical fruits could be procured in abundance. Having ranged about the Pedir Raja's district, near the sea coast, I returned on board in the evening with the collection I had made. Among the natives that occasionally came on board with the cargo boats, as well as those seen on shore, consisting of different races of Hindustan, Malays, etc., there were several with the African features and hair, none of whom, however, were well-formed or handsome men, but still seemed to possess great muscular power. They were of that African race designated the Black Arabs, who were shipped as seamen on board vessels at Bushire and other places in the Persian Gulf. When I was looking at this variety of the human race, one of the Raja's followers said he was the property of the Raja, and he would sell him to me if I wanted him. As I did not require a specimen of that kind, I declined this very obliging offer. The land and sea breezes were for some days very regular, and at others extremely irregular, varying also in their degree of strength. The range of the thermometer, during the short period I remained on this coast, was from 79 degrees to 88 degrees. Early one morning, a party was formed to endeavour to obtain a view of the country further inland. On landing at the village of Pedir, we were met by the old trading minister, who accompanied us. The houses of the natives were constructed of bamboo, raised, like all the Malay residences, upon strong posts, a short distance from the ground, and the ascent to the rooms above was by bamboo ladders. The habitations are covered with a thatch, formed from the leaves of different kinds of palms, and the dwellings are cool. This quality, so desirable in sultry climates, is given to them by gardens surrounding the habitations, filled with trees, imparting a refreshing verdure, and from the blossoms delightful odours were exhaled. Among the more elevated kinds were the graceful and majestic cocoa nut, and the straight areca palm, Areca catechu, surmounted by its tuft of dark green foliage and its long pendant clusters of orange-coloured fruit of an oval form. The Artocarpus incisor, or jack tree, the broad-leaved plantain, the mango, orange, lime, and occasionally, but rarely, the breadfruit trees. A. integrifolia, ornamented the garden. That most elegant as well as largest of the gramineous plants, the bamboo, triang of the natives, was abundant, as fences about many of the dwellings, as well as the Erythrina corolodendron or mankudu of the natives, the Jatropha curcus or banawa of the natives, and in distinct clumps. The piper betel trailed up some of the trees, and the Abrus precatorius, anasagar of the natives, with its pods, containing small but beautiful crimson seeds, hung in festoons from the bushes in the jungle, and a diosma, called grapum by the natives, was abundant and fragrant. The manihot, Jatropha manihot, was also seen, and although I was informed the root was prepared and eaten, the shrub did not seem to be extensively planted. The carambola trees, Averroa carambola, were numerous and called boslemang. A quantity of the fruit was observed laid upon a raised bamboo platform, spread out to dry in the sun, and natives appeared fond of eating them in a raw state, as well as using them in many of their curries and other dishes. About some of the native habitations, that large and elegant palm, the Berossus gomatus of Loureiro, the Sagerus pinnatus of the Batavian transactions, and the Cleophora of Gertner, was planted. It is Anau of the Sumatrans, was called at this place Eju, and Do by the Javanese. It is valued on account of excellent toddy being extracted from it, but more especially for the black fibres collected from the trunk, about the bases of the petioles of the fronds, which fibrous substance resembles somewhat in its appearance, as well as elasticity, horsehair. And it is highly esteemed for the manufacture of rope used for their seines, vessels, etc. The very thick fibres, the natives say, the Mormen resident here uses as pens, and call them pure edu. It is probably the same tree from which the fibres, called Cabo Negro by the Spaniards, are procured at Manila, and from which they also manufacture rope. We continued our ramble over a fine plain, terminated in the distance by palms, bamboos, the broad-leaved plantain, and other elegant trees were seen, ornamenting some lonely habitation, the roof just appearing above the dense foliage. The plain at one season of the year is covered with rice fields, but was now dried up. The stubble of the former harvest remained, and the whole was covered by an abundance of herbage, affording feeding for herds of cattle. A number of various species of grilli were hopping about the fields, and were caught by the native boys for my entomological collection. They called them, in the language of the country, darua, and these insects are eaten by the natives. End of chapter 20.
Section 21 of Wanderings in New South Wales, Batavia, Pedir Coast, Singapore and China, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jennifer Beckett-Wood. Wanderings in New South Wales, Batavia, Pedir Coast, Singapore and China, Volume 1 by George Bennett. Chapter 21. The country about Pedir, as far as I had an opportunity of seeing it, was very picturesque, abounding in a luxuriant natural vegetation, as well as in a state of cultivation. The native habitations are almost hidden by coconut, plantain, areca, eju, jack, and other trees. Fragrant odours were exhaled from the multitude of flowers which strewed the surface of the ground, and a variety of profuse vegetation was spread over the face of nature. The soil is rich, and the numerous vegetables, among which the purple and white yams are abundant, planted in the gardens of the natives, are most prolific. The habitations, as I have before noticed, are raised upon posts, which I should suppose, in these marshy situations, are intended to guard against the miasmata which must rise from the surface of the ground after the rains, and to the influence of which the inhabitants would be much exposed if their dwellings were not placed on an elevated site. The plain is beautiful, and the background of the landscape is terminated by mountains, varying in elevation and extending in a direction principally from east to west, sometimes covered by fleecy clouds, and at others glowing in the varying and beautiful tints of a setting sun, which cast its expiring rays, undimmed by a cloud, over the towering masses. After walking in the vicinity of the village, for our guides evinced no desire of taking us further inland, we were desired to enter a house to rest ourselves. By an invitation to enter is only meant being seated in the veranda, for we did not, or rather were not permitted to, intrude ourselves into any other parts of the dwelling. At this place coconut water was again offered as a refreshment. We requested to be taken further in the interior of the country, but, although a refusal was never given, yet we found we were invariably taken, by other paths, back to the place from whence we came. We became at last, from this and other circumstances, convinced that our Moor friends were fearful of exposing themselves to the krises of the hill people, from whom they appeared to have conquered some portion of the country, establishing themselves as traders. We returned after a short ramble, and were conducted into the bazaar, and seated with a semicircle of the natives before us, all staring quietly and decorously at the white lions. From this place we adjourned to the fort near the Rajah's residence, where we waited for the appearance of His Highness, who had not yet risen from his couch. The old minister gave us some account of the Rajah's habits, one of which was that he lies in bed until 3 p.m., except when there is any particular business, such as the arrival of a ship, to induce him to rise earlier, and he does not retire to rest until 3 a.m., after smoking a pipe of opium. The old gentleman must have been guilty of an exaggeration when he stated that the Rajah would smoke a ball of opium in 4 days. His Highness is only 18 years of age, and has not at present the appearance of an opium smoker. It must have been the quantity consumed by the Rajah and his numerous followers that was meant, the whole of which was placed to the Rajah's account. Pipes of opium were offered to us to regale ourselves, but of course were refused. After some delay the Rajah came to visit us, having just risen from his couch, unwashed and attired in unclean garments. He shook hands, in the European manner, with the party, and then, having but little to say, from want of some other employment, he amused himself with my insect boxes, and the insects placed in them transfixed by pins. This led to an explanation of my professional pursuits and its collateral branches, but as the subject was rather beyond his comprehension, he became attracted from it to a cloth cap worn by one of the party, about which there was much discussion, the result of which was that the Rajah and his followers came to the important decision that it would make a very good pocket or case for containing betel nut and the accompanying articles required to be used with it. Being heartily tired, we were happy to escape from the royal presence, and the boat being ready, we returned on board. All the women had the lobes of the ears enormously distended, from wearing, when very young, round pieces of wood, polished and ornamented, or rolls of leaves in them. The richer classes wear large ornaments of gold and silver. The old women have the lobes hanging down to a great length, but without ornament. That they formerly had placed them in the lobes was evident by the distended orifices, which, having lost their elasticity, prevented their retention as before. The poorer classes are content with neatly polished and ornamented round pieces of wood, or a roll of the plantain or some other kind of leaf, as a substitute for those of gold and silver worn by the higher and richer classes. The lower class of females were usually attired in cotton cloth sarongs, and the kabaya passing over the head of a black colour or other dark patterns. As we passed their dwellings, they came forth, with the usual feminine curiosity, to view the strangers. Indeed, we appeared to be as much objects of curiosity among them as I had before been when landing upon many of the unfrequented islands of the Polynesian archipelago. And the natives that arrived in the boats with areca nut from the villages on the coast seemed to regard us as wonders, and surrounded the entrance of the poop cuddy at meal times, as if to satisfy themselves how such animals fed. We had an offer of some of the Rajah's horses to ride about the village. At first it was thought that some dun cows, with horns cut off close to the head and a preternatural erection of the ears, were the animals offered, but it appears they were real ponies. If we had ridden them, however, it must have been without any saddle or bridle, for there were no articles of that description to be procured at Pedir. The bark at present at anchor in Pedir Roads, under the Achenese flag, was captured from the Rajah of Trumong, on the west coast of Sumatra, by the man-of-war grab belonging to the Rajah of Achin. The cause of it was this. The Trumong Rajah is tributary to the king, or Rajah of Achin. He had not paid tribute for 3 years, and on it being demanded, the Trumong Rajah returned for answer that he intended paying it with iron balls. War was therefore declared against this rebellious Rajah, and the bark was captured by the following stratagem. The commander of His Achinese Majesty's grab fell in with the bark at sea, assured her commander that all differences had been adjusted between the two Rajahs, and requested him to come on board. The captain of the bark unsuspectingly accepted the invitation, taking presents with him. On stepping upon the deck of the grab, himself, crew, and presents were detained, and a boat, with a number of men well armed, sent on board the bark, and having secured the guns, hauled down the Trumong Rajah's colours and hoisted those of His Achinese Majesty. The vessels will sail in company for Achin in a few days. A Madras native, who spoke a little English, amused us with his version of the affair. I belong and bark belong to the Rajah of Trumong. Achin Rajah and my Rajah make war. Trumong Rajah plenty dollars and go by ships at Pulo Penang to fight Rajah Achin. Achin Rajah very poor, one day buy ship, in a month want sell because very poor. Achin Rajah no good, no pay Lascars. Trumong Rajah my king pay well, plenty dollars. My bark got 7 guns and 12 Lascar men. The grab send a boat and ask, whose bark this? My captain say, Rajah Trumong's. Then grab's men take prisoners and say, bark belong now to Achin Rajah, so he pulled down colours. Our colours before white and black. Now Achin colours red and white. The quantity of betel nut agreed for, 3,000 pekuls, was sent on board, and a further agreement entered into for 3,000 pekuls more, to be delivered in a few days after. Opium at $900 the chest was taken in part payment. This was a high price, but netted to the sellers a profit of only 95 Java rupees, or $47. From the large quantity in the market at this place, it was with the greatest difficulty it could be disposed of even at that price. The dollars to be given in addition must have been the principal inducement, for opium had been purchased from the Penang brig Calder Bucks at $770 the chest. But we afterwards found only $1 the pekul, or rather laksar, had been paid by that vessel, which will account for their giving in barter a higher price for the opium. On the second agreement being made, the Rajah and suite came on board to ratify it, which, after some disputes and discussions with all parties, was effected by the supercargo of the ship. The principal article of exportation from this coast is areca nut and a small quantity of rice. The latter, however, appeared of an inferior quality, and $1.50 a pecul was demanded as the lowest price. The vessel would be required to furnish bags for the rice, as there are none manufactured on the coast, and a delay of the vessel would be also required to procure it. Areca nut must, therefore, be regarded as the principal article of trade, as it is to be purchased cheap and of a quality as excellent as in any part of the Eastern Islands or Cochin China. The areca palm is the Areca catechu of botanists. It is a palm of elegant growth, rising with a very erect and small stem to the height of 40 or even 60 feet, the summit terminating in a tuft of dark green foliage. The circumference of the trunk is seldom more than 1.5 to 2 feet, when of early growth of dark green, and when old of a dark grey colour. The circles formed by the clasping petioles of the fronds being very visible upon it. The tree bears fruit only once during the year, at which period the tree, with its long bunches of orange oval-shaped fruit pendant from the upper part of the trunk, contrasted by the dark green foliage, has a beautiful appearance. The areca nut, when planted, takes 3 years to arrive at a sufficient size to produce fruit. The wood of this palm is used at this place for a variety of purposes. The fruit grows in long pendulous clusters, each about the size of a small hen's egg. The external covering is thick, fibrous, covered by an orange-coloured epidermis, and on the thick fibrous husk being cleared away, the nut is discovered surrounded by its own immediate epidermis, which often proves difficult of removal. The nut is conical, but varies in some, having an elevated apex and small base, and others a large base and very slightly elevated apex. One nut is the natural produce of each fruit, although sometimes double or triple nuts are found, anomalies often met with in the vegetable kingdom. Many of the common drinking and bailing utensils in the boats are made from the spathe of the areca palm, and I have frequently seen a vessel for holding water made from it, which was not dissimilar to those made by the Australian natives from the bark of the eucalypti trees. They use the flower spathe also for nailing upon the bottoms of their boat. May, June, and July are the months for collecting the nuts. They had loaded 9 ships this season, but 40 vessels of all sizes have been freighted in one season for Penang, etc., from whence it is exported to China, Madras, and other parts of continental India. The nuts vary in size. Their quality, however, does not at all depend upon this property, but upon their internal appearance when cut, intimating the quantity of astringent matter contained in them. If the white or medullary portion, which intersects the red or astringent part, be small, has assumed a bluish tinge, and the astringent part is very red, the nut is considered of good quality. But when the medullary portion is in large quantity, the nut is considered more mature, and not possessing so much astringency, is not esteemed so valuable. The quantity of nut produced on this coast is stated to be 80,000 peculs. When there is no immediate demand for this article, it is not shelled but preserved in the husk, as it is considered not to be so liable to be destroyed by the worm in that state. But although this is the opinion of the natives on the coast, yet I have seen nuts destroyed totally by the worm while in the husk in the space of 2 months. The produce of the first month, or month and a half, amounting usually to 40,000 peculs, the natives informed us is exported, and the second gathering, amounting to about the same quantity, is consumed in the country. The nuts were brought on board the ship in large boats, originally built and employed as fishing vessels, except when required for this employment. They are from 3 to 4 tons burthen each, and are to be purchased for $20 or $25. In bulk and manila mat bags, and are taken on board the ships in bulk. The quantity of areca nut imported by the Chinese amounts to 45 or 48,000 pecels annually, exclusive of that brought from Cochin China, the amount of which is not known. In 1832, from a failure of the usual supply of nuts from Cochin China, 48,000 pecels imported from other places sold so high as $4.75 the pecal. The price it usually fetches in the China market is from $2 to $3.75 the pecal. The principal consumption of the nut as a masticatory, in conjunction with the leaf called beetle, produced from a vine, the piper beetle, is in the provinces of Guangdong, Canton of Europeans, Guangxi, and Zhejiang, and may be seen exposed for sale on little stalls about the suburbs of Canton, with the other additional articles used in the preparation. It is also used as a mordant for coarse dyes. The areca nuts brought from Cochin China are considered by the Chinese the best imported. This may, however, arise from prejudice in favour of the production of a country so nearly allied to them, to that introduced by foreigners. In the central provinces of Hukwang and Kangxi, the nut is, after being bruised and pounded, mixed with the green food of horses as a preventative against a diarrhoea, to which that kind of food sometimes subjects them. It was likewise mentioned to me by Chinese that it is used as a domestic medicine in the north of China, small pieces being boiled. The decoction is administered in various visceral affections. A cargo of this article generates so much heat as to raise the thermometer in the hold 40 degrees above that on the deck, and from this circumstance and the quantity of steam generated, the crew are prevented from sleeping between decks. The areca nut is commonly known by the very prevailing Malay name of pinang or pinong, but in the Achinese language it is called penu, and the tree ba penu. Ba, signifying tree, is usually prefixed to the specific name, as signifying plant, is prefixed to the name of a plant. The ripe areca nut is also called penu masa, and the green penu mudr. The gambia used with the beetle, gambe, the beetle leaf ranu, the chunam, gapu, the tobacco, bakun. The Rajah of Pedir claims 10% as a duty levied in kind upon all the areca nut disposed of to ships arriving in his territory, and, besides this, his subjects are obliged to dispose of the nuts to the ship at the price he or his ministers have agreed upon with the supercargo. The red colour, produced by chewing the beetle leaf in combination with the areca nut, lime, etc., is not produced by them when used separately. The mastication of the beetle is considered very wholesome by those who are in the habit of using it. It may be so, but the black appearance it gives to the teeth, although it is said to be an excellent preserver of them, together with the brick-red lips and mouth, give anything but an agreeable appearance. Its use certainly does not impart additional beauty to the native females, who habituate themselves to an equal extent to those of the opposite sex. There was an old native of Madras, a Moorman, forming one of the Rajah's attendants on board, whose duty it was to visit ships and report their arrival to His Highness, and also to attend the ship daily to see the cargo taken on board. This individual had one of his hands rendered useless by a blow from a klawang, or Malay sword. Besides the scar resulting from this wound, there was an unreduced dislocation of the carpal extremity of the ulna and a fracture of the radius, which, being disunited, an artificial joint had been formed. The cause of this personal injury, he said, proceeded from an attack made upon a vessel he was in by one belonging to the Rajah of Ashin, in which several people were killed. This individual, being on board one morning, although professing in external appearances the Mahometan creed, expressed a desire to having a tumbler of the stimulating beverage denominated grog, if it could be administered without it being seen, proving that his religious scruples were not so strong in private as his veneration for public opinion, or a fear of losing caste. A stiff glass of grog was therefore prepared for him, which the old withered disciple of Mahometanism regarded with glittering eyes. There was also on board another Mussulman, whose duty it was to take account of the cargo as it came to the ship and report the quantity to the Rajah. The sinner was about to raise the glass to his mouth, exclaiming, "What would the other man say if he was to see me now?" when the old saying was verified of, "There is many a slip between the cup and the lip." For the scribe was, at the same instant, seen descending, and there was only time to conceal the glass before he was close to him. The old fellow stroked his whiskers and began seriously to talk about opium, and as the white turbaned man saw him clear out from below, the long-sought enjoyment was obliged to be postponed. A Chittagong brig, commanded by a black Portuguese, anchored in the roads on the 10th of July from the Maldive Islands bound to Penang, with a cargo of dried fish and some tortoiseshell, which had been procured in exchange for rice. His object was to dispose of his cargo in exchange for dollars and betel nut at this place. The dried fish was the bonito cut into small pieces. The Maldive natives prepare it in the following manner. A long slice is cut from each side of the fish, and these again are divided into 2 parts, so that each fish is divided into 4 pieces. It is then boiled for a short time in salt water, after which it is smoked and placed in the sun to dry. It then becomes extremely hard and resembles, when broken, a piece of wood, having a reddish appearance at the fractured parts. After it has been soaked, it is used for curries and other native dishes. The Golden Mountain is a very conspicuous and beautiful object from the anchorage, but it ought to be mentioned that, from this position, 2 mountains are seen to the westward, one towering to a peak and densely wooded. The other, anterior to it, is a lofty, rounded hill. The first is the one known to Europeans as the Golden Mountain. The second, or rounded mountain, is not named in the charts, but it may be called the Pedir Mountain. The Golden Mountain is called by the natives Yamori, and the other Yamora. The first the natives designate as the father, the second the mother, probably of all the little mountains about them. The natives state that once every year the mountains come together, occasioning rain, thunder, lightning, earthquakes, and violent storms. The Yurong Sal, or Fire King, then sits upon the mountain, surrounded by hideous demons, enjoying the noise and uproar occasioned by the conflict of the elements. The winds blow in violent tornadoes. The thunder is so loud as to occasion the earth to tremble under the feet of the terrified inhabitants. The rain causes tremendous mountain torrents, inundating habitations and plantations, carrying all before them in their impetuous course and spreading devastation around. In the midst of this dreadful conflict of the elements, the mountains meet with a horrible crash. As the forked lightning plays around them, the Yurong Sal, or Fire King, surrounded by his satellites, laughs and sports in the scene. The mountains remain united for a minute, when they again separate, regaining their former position. No person dare ascend the hill at any time, for there sits the Fire King and his demons, and should any mortal cast his eyes upon him, that instant he would be struck with blindness. Yamora is stated to be distant inland from Pedir 2 days' journey travelling on foot, and Yamori is the same distance from the other mountain. Not, however, as the crow flies, but it would take that period of time to reach it, from the winding and difficulties of the road. From this account there is every reason to suppose that earthquakes and volcanic eruptions are occasionally felt upon this coast. As far as we could ascertain, there was no appearance of a burning volcano existing in either of the mountains just mentioned. They were both densely clothed in vegetation, more especially the Golden Mountain. Near the banks of the river, a short distance up, is an unenclosed native burial ground. The graves had a stone or piece of wood placed both at the head and foot. There were several trees of Hibiscus tilaceus, Tamarindus indica, and a very large one called Bar Glumpong by the natives, Sterculia foetida, Linnaeus, which was described by them as being poisonous, producing violent vomiting and pains in the head if the fruit be eaten. I subsequently saw it planted about the fences in the village. There were 2 of these fine, lofty and spreading trees in the burial ground, and I procured specimens both of the flowers and fruit. The former grew in clusters upon erect spikes, with a corolla of a dark red mixed with yellowish green. They have a handsome appearance, but diffuse so fetid a smell around as soon to fill a room with the exceedingly disagreeable effluvia. The fruit is kidney-shaped. The trees were 60 or 70 feet in height and from 8 to 10 feet in circumference. A piece of sandalwood of good quality was brought off to the ship by one of the natives. He stated that large quantities of it could be procured, as the tree grew abundantly in the mountains. He gave it the usual Indian appellation of chandana. In some brackish pools I collected several small living species of the cerethium, and about the banks a great number of a small crab, remarkable from one of the claws being greatly disproportioned to the size of the other parts of the animal, and entirely different in colour. When I first beheld them, I mistook them for small crabs running away with the claws of larger ones. They are difficult to catch, from the exceeding rapidity of their motions, and escape, on the slightest movement or noise being made, into their subterraneous dwellings in the sand. The body and feet of the animal are bluish-black, with a few white marks across, and the large claw is of a light or occasional darker red colour. The natives call them biongpo. They are seen in great numbers about the pools, but are not eaten by the natives. I procured several specimens, which I preserved in spirits. On being placed in strong rum, they survived for the space of full 3 minutes, and if more than one was placed in the same bottle, they would fight and pull the claws off each other in their death agonies. Near the village, several boys were playing a game with areca nuts called mai nachu, in some degree resembling our game at marbles. 4 nuts were piled up in form of a pyramid, 12 such forming a row. A nut was then filliped off with some degree of force against the heaps, from a distance of about 3 yards. If the thrower succeeds in destroying one of the pyramids, he renews his throw at the others, always at the distance where his nut remained, until he misses, when the next player takes his turn, the game thus continuing until all the pyramids are thrown down. I was much surprised a few days since, while passing a house in the vicinity of the village, to see apparently a European lad of about 6 years of age, and on examining him closer, found his skin of a white colour, thinly scattered over with small light brown patches. On passing the same house again, I made inquiry on the subject, and then had an opportunity of seeing 2 others who were females, one about 16 or 18 years of age, the other an infant just able to run about. They were described to us as children of native Malay parents, of the usual colour of their race, but we did not see them, as they had gone a short distance into the country. The children were named Sete, Thete, and Cbteddy. They had a plump appearance, flaxen hair, light blue eyes, and the boy and young woman were slightly covered with scattered small brown patches, but the infant had not a blemish on its integument. The natives could give no reason for this variety. They looked upon it as curious, but did not seem, as far as I could ascertain, to regard it as a disease. They have the flat nose of the Malay, but otherwise would be considered the offspring of European parents, the skin being in some degree freckled. It ought certainly to be regarded as a variety of, if not actually the disease, called leprosy. I met several natives going into the interior. They were all well armed with krisses, klawangs or Malay swords, spears, and blunderbusses or muskets, the country in the interior being described as in a very unsettled state. Some of the spears were about 6 feet long, resembling walking staves, covered above by a wooden sheath, similar to the other part of the weapon, and ornamented with rims of silver. The upper part, or sheath, being taken off, displays the head of the spear. I purchased a specimen of the vivera masanga, similar to one I had before procured at Java for half a rupee. Although very wild with strangers, it was exceedingly domesticated with its master, following him like a cat as he walked along the path. They called him on this coast, as at Java, Musang. This specimen was very little larger than one I had before procured, but they attain, I was informed, the size of our domestic cat, living in the wild state upon the summits of the trees, eating fruit and catching birds as their food. The animal is very fond of sugar cane, plantain, rice, and the flesh of fowls, and will also kill and eat those troublesome insects, the cockroaches. It, however, became so very savage on board that I was obliged at last to destroy it. I was frequently applied to by the natives when sick to administer medicines to them. There were several suffering from different kinds of tumours. One near the nose I offered to remove, but although the person promised to come on board for the purpose, I afterwards heard he was afraid and altered his mind. Among many patients was a little girl belonging to a Mormon, suffering from diarrhea mucosa. Her body had been rubbed entirely over with a mixture of turmeric, sandalwood, and oil as a remedy for the disease. The yellow appearance, the usual indication of sickness, was not the result, as may have been expected, of some disease, but merely a daubing over the body of the above-mentioned composition, this being the remedy for all diseases. The common Hindu application of cow dung and turmeric is frequent for external wounds or bruises, and considered a very efficacious remedy. Cutaneous diseases were very numerous, and the native applications proved very inefficacious in removing them. I had an opportunity of seeing another Rajah, the Rajah of Putu, a village and district not far distant on the sea coast. He was ill-looking in person and carried with him the appearance of being addicted to opium smoking. He was attired in a sarong of a handsome pattern, the borders of which were woven with gold threads. These sarongs are the manufacture of the country and are sold at high prices. The Rajah was tall and young and was attended by a numerous retinue attired in red cloth jackets ornamented with gold lace and handsome sarongs. Others could only wear a cotton baju or jacket. They were armed with spears, klawangs, krisses, and old rusty blunderbusses. The object of his visit to this place was to pay his respects to the old queen, grandmother of the present Rajah, of Achin, who was residing at Pedir and was about to embark in a few days in the Achinese grab for Achin, and was described as being an excellent old lady. End of section 21. End of Wanderings in New South Wales, Batavia, Pedir Coast, Singapore and China, Volume 1, by George Bennett.